The road ran out before the farm did. She had walked the last half-mile on foot, her worn canvas bag hanging from one shoulder, the strap soft from years of use. The county road dissolved into two pale ruts through the grass, and those ruts ended at a gate that hung open on a single hinge, leaning into the weeds, as though it had given up the effort of standing straight long ago. She stepped through it anyway. The farmhouse sat low on a gentle rise, its paint long since gone to gray, its porch sagging at one corner where a support had slowly surrendered to time and wet winters. A stand of old oak trees pressed close on the north side, their roots lifting the ground around the foundation into soft ridges. The windows were clouded but unbroken. That felt like a small mercy. She had learned about this place from a notice tacked to the board outside the county land office. One page, water-stained at the corner, offering the property on a modest lease because no one had claimed it, and no one, apparently, wanted it. The woman who had kept this farm had passed away without family, and the land had simply waited, the way land does, patient and indifferent. She had read that notice 3 times before folding it into her coat pocket. She had $11 and a bag of dry goods and no room waiting for her in town. There had not been much to deliberate. Now she stood in the tall grass and looked at the place that might become hers and tried to see it honestly. The orchard ran along the eastern edge of the property in an untidy row, apple trees, pear trees, and what she thought might be wild plum, their branches unpruned and crossing each other at awkward angles, some weighted down with suckers, but none of them dead. She could see that plainly, neglected, yes, struggling, but alive at the root. She walked the perimeter slowly, the seed heads of late summer grasses brushing against her sleeves. The air smelled of dry earth, and something faintly sweet she could not yet name. She found them behind the farmhouse. They stood in long rows, perhaps a dozen rows deep, stretching back from the rear of the house toward a line of old cedar posts that marked what had once been a field boundary. 100 wooden hives, or something close to it. She counted the rows and then stopped counting. Each box was weathered to the same soft silver gray, the wood warped in places, lids swollen by seasons of rain and heat. They looked like they had been standing there since before she was born, and they looked entirely, completely silent. She walked between the rows with her bag still on her shoulder, reading them the way she might read a room she had just entered. The late afternoon light stretched long across the tops of the hives and made their shadows lean away from her in thin lines. Something in her chest went quiet. Not afraid, just listening. She walked the first row slowly, trailing her fingers along the side of one hive and then lifting them away. The wood felt like driftwood, smooth in places and rough in others, the grain raised by years of weather until it had its own texture, almost like bark. She pressed her palm flat against one lid and held it there. Nothing. No warmth, no movement. She moved to the next, and then the next, and they were all the same, cool, still, hollow feeling in the way that empty things always feel, as if the absence inside has weight of its own. She walked the second row and the third. She did not hurry. The long light was still with her, and the air had that particular stillness that comes just before the sky begins to change color, when the world holds itself for a moment between one thing and the next. Grasshoppers leapt from her path, and the dry grass rasped softly against her ankles, and she counted the hives by habit, even though she had stopped meaning to, and somewhere around the 7th row, she noticed that her counting had become a kind of prayer, though she could not have said what she was praying for exactly. At the end of the last row, the light reached the lowest angle, and it was there that she saw it. It was smaller than the others. That was the first thing. Where every other hive was built to the same rough dimensions, this one stood perhaps 2 handspans shorter, as if it had been made for a different purpose, or made by a different pair of hands. The wood was darker too, not the soft silver gray of the others, but something deeper, closer to the color of river mud dried in shade, a warm brown that suggested age of a different kind. And along the front face, along the edges of the lid, worked into the wood, in shallow deliberate cuts, there were flowers. Simple ones. Petals like children draw, 5 to a bloom, running in a continuous band, as if someone had taken a long quiet afternoon to put them there. She crouched in front of it, and looked at them for a moment. Then she heard it. It came up through the soles of her boots before it reached her ears, a low vibration that was more felt than heard, rising steadily from the ground and from the hive itself, continuous and warm and utterly alive. She went very still. The sound was like the lowest string of an instrument played somewhere just beyond hearing, and it did not stop. She leaned forward and pressed her ear against the wood. The hum moved through the side of her jaw and into her teeth and down into her collarbone. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the sound of thousands of small lives going about their work in the dark, patient and purposeful, completely indifferent to the decade that had passed outside their walls. Her eyes closed without her deciding to close them. The hive was alive. She stayed crouched in front of the hive for a long time, her ear against the old wood, listening to something the rest of the world had given up on. The sun had moved by the time she finally straightened, her knees stiff and her thoughts slow and full, the way thoughts get when something quietly important has just happened. She walked back through the rows of silent hives toward the farmhouse, trailing her fingers along the weathered edges of boxes as she passed. Most of them gave back nothing. No vibration, no warmth, just dry wood, gone gray with time. She had expected that. But it no longer felt like defeat. It felt more like the difference between a field in winter and a field in spring. The same ground, but not the same story. The farmhouse door swung open without complaint, the hinges just stiff enough to remind her they were old. Inside, the light came in sideways through small windows and lay in pale rectangles across the floor. The kitchen was simple, a wood stove, a stone sink, a rough-hewn table, and walls that had once been plastered white and were now the color of old cream. She had already noted, on her first walk-through, that one of the bricks above the stove sat slightly proud of the others, its edge a little higher, as if whoever had laid it had pulled it back out more than once. She pressed her palm against it now. It shifted inward, then tilted, and she worked it free with both hands, setting it on the table with a soft thud of old mortar dust. Behind the brick, in the shallow space that had been left there on purpose, was a book. It was not a large book. It was the size of a ledger, bound in brown cloth that had gone soft at the corners, the spine held together by a length of waxed linen cord someone had tied with patience. She brought it to the table and sat down. The first page had no title, just a date, many years back, and beneath it, in small, deliberate handwriting, a single line. What the bees teach, they teach slowly. She turned the pages carefully. What unfolded was a season-by-season account of this farm and these hives, written in the same steady hand, with ink that had faded from black to a warm dark brown at the edges. There were notes on which trees flowered when, notes on how long to leave a new colony before opening the box, notes on reading bee behavior the way some people read weather, by watching the angle of flight, the sound of the cluster, the smell that drifted from the entrance on warm evenings. And between the notes, sketches. Frame after frame drawn with care, the geometry of comb, the shape of a laying pattern, the difference between capped honey and capped brood. She turned another page and found a hand-drawn map of the orchard, each tree marked by type, and beside each one, a small notation of what the bees brought back from it in different months. She set her hand flat on the open page. Outside, the late afternoon settled around the farmhouse like something that had been waiting. She spent that first night on a cot she found folded in the back room, the journal open beside her until the candle burned low. When she finally slept, it was the deep, unguarded sleep of someone who has found a direction, even if the road is long. Morning came in through a single east-facing window, pale and unhurried. She rose before it fully arrived, pulled on her boots, and walked the hive rows again, this time with the journal tucked under her arm. She moved slowly, the way the old woman's handwriting had suggested, letting herself become part of the landscape rather than an interruption to it. Most hives were silent. She pressed her ear to one, then another, the way you press a shell to hear the sea inside it. Nothing. The wood was dry and hollow-sounding, like tapping on an old bone. But the last hive still held its low, living note. She stood there a long while, just listening. Word moved through small towns, the way water moves through a crack in stone. Quietly, steadily, and into every low place. By the end of that first week, people knew. A young woman had taken up on the old property at the end of the county road, was living out there, was, apparently, trying to work those hives. The prosperous farmer who held the land next door heard it at the feed store. He heard it again at the counter of the post office. By the time he walked the fence line that divided his cultivated, productive acres from the overgrown tangle of the old farm, he had already formed his opinion, and his opinion had already formed his expression. She was pulling weeds from the base of one of the pear trees when she heard the latch of the fence gate rattle. She looked up. He was a broad man, weathered but comfortable in the way that comes from land that has always provided, from fields that had never failed him because he had never gambled on them. He stood at the fence line with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders and looked out across the rows of weathered hives with an unhurried, professional eye. He did not step through. He surveyed from the boundary, the way a man surveys something he does not consider worth entering. "Those hives have been empty for going on 10 years, he said. His voice was not unkind, exactly. It was the voice of a man who considers himself a realist, which is sometimes the same thing. Every beekeeper in the county knows it. Old woman let them go long before she passed. Nothing in them but dry wood and old wax." She stood with her hands still at the base of the pear tree. She did not answer right away. "You're putting what little you have into a graveyard," he continued. He almost sounded sorry about it, which was worse than if he had sounded pleased. "Might be better to find yourself honest work somewhere." He clicked the fence gate closed and walked back toward his own land, without waiting for her reply. She let his words settle, the way dust settles after a wagon passes, briefly, then still. She turned back to the pear tree and pressed her palm flat against its bark, feeling the rough texture of it, the stubborn aliveness beneath. Then she went inside. The journal was on the kitchen table, where she had left it the night before, open to a page dense with careful handwriting. The old woman's script was small and even, the letters unhurried, as if she had written each one knowing it might someday need to be read by a stranger. The page described the oldest hive. She had called it the mother hive, and the instructions for a first inspection were specific in a way that felt almost like a warning given gently. "Move slowly, do not startle, let your breath be even. Smoke helps, but the old colony does not need much. They are calm if you are calm." She had spent 3 days building up her nerve. She had read the page so many times she could close her eyes and hear the sentences in someone else's voice. That morning, she lit the small smoker she had found, hanging on a nail in the barn, using a handful of dry burlap and a few pine chips the way the journal described, and she carried it down the long row of silver hives without hurrying. The oldest hive sat at the very end of the last row, shorter than the others, its wood darkened to the color of walnut by decades of weather. The flower shapes carved along its lower edges were worn smooth, barely visible unless the light caught them at an angle. She crouched in front of it for a moment and watched. A slow, steady thread of bees moved in and out of the entrance. Not frantic, not swarming, just unhurried and purposeful, the way a well-managed household moves through a morning's work. She puffed a small breath of smoke across the entrance, waited, then she lifted the lid. The smell reached her first, warm and dark and ancient, like wood and flowers and time compressed into something almost edible. She set the lid aside and looked down. Frame after frame of honeycomb hung heavy in the box, each one packed full, the wax capped and smooth in places, uncapped and glistening in others, the dark amber of it deeper than any honey she had ever seen in a store jar. The bees moved across the surface in slow, unhurried waves, tending each cell with a focused quiet that made the whole colony feel like one breathing thing. She had forgotten to wear the gloves she had found in the barn. She did not reach for them now. She held her bare hands over the open hive and let them rest near the frames. A bee landed on the back of her left hand, walked 3 deliberate steps, and flew away. Another landed on her wrist. She did not flinch. She did not pull back. She stood completely still and let her breath go soft and slow, and the bees moved around her and across her, as if she were simply part of the hive's world now, as if they had always known she was coming. She closed the hive slowly, the way she had seen it done in her mind 100 times, without knowing she had been imagining it. She set the lid back into place with both hands, pressing gently until it settled, and stood there a moment longer, with her palms resting on the warm wood. The buzzing continued beneath her, steady and low, unchanged by her visit. That felt like the most important thing. In the days that followed, she began at the beginning of the first row and worked her way down. She moved one hive at a time. She would lift a corner first, tilting it slightly to feel the weight, and most were feather-light, hollow feeling in the way that empty things always are when you have felt a full one. Those she set aside, cleaned inside with a stiff brush she had found hanging in the barn, and left open to air in the slanted afternoon sun. Some had old comb inside, dry and brittle, the color of old paper. Some had nothing at all. She cleared them out without sentimentality, because the journal had told her that cleanliness was the first kindness you could offer a new colony, and she was already thinking forward to spring. But not every hive was empty. By the time the first hard frost came, she had found 6 more living colonies scattered through the rows, each one tucked into a hive that looked no different from its dead neighbors from the outside. She learned to press her ear to the wood before lifting the lid, listening for that particular low murmur that was not wind and not her own breath. Twice she almost missed a colony because the sound was so faint, a small cluster hanging together in a back corner, thin but alive, the kind of alive that only needs a little steadiness to hold on through winter. She packed those hives with care, following the journal's instructions for cold weather, reducing the entrances to narrow slits, wrapping the boxes in old burlap she found folded in the cellar, weighing the lids with stones so the wind could not take them. 7 colonies now, 7 small nations, she thought, choosing to survive. She watched where the bees flew each morning. Even in the shortening days, when the temperature barely climbed above cool, the bees from the oldest hive would orient themselves in the first thin light and set out in the same direction, northeast, toward the far end of the orchard, where 3 wild plum trees still held the last of their dried fruit. She followed them one morning, walking through the tall grass with dew soaking into her boots, and stood beneath those plum trees and looked at them more carefully than she had before. The bark was sound. The root crowns looked firm where they met the soil. They were not dying. They had simply been left. She began clearing around them that same afternoon, pulling dead wood and old weeds by hand, working until the light went gray, and her arms were tired, and the crows in the far hedgerow had gone quiet for the night. Winter came in the first week of November, not gradually the way it sometimes does in that part of the country, but all at once, as if a door had been shut on autumn overnight. She woke to frost on the inside of the farmhouse windows, and a silence so complete it felt like the land itself had drawn a breath and held it. She had been preparing for weeks, and still the cold surprised her with its weight. The 7 colonies needed more than burlap now. She gathered straw from the old barn in armloads, packing it thick around the base of each wrapped hive, tucking it under the edges where the wind found gaps. She worked through the mornings with her hands going numb inside her thin gloves, her breath coming in small white clouds, moving from hive to hive, down each row the way she imagined the old woman who had kept this farm might once have done, touching each box briefly, listening. She had learned to listen. A healthy winter cluster makes a sound, low and steady as a held note, if you press your ear close enough to the wood. 7 times she listened. 7 times she heard it. The sugar syrup was the harder problem. The bees needed supplemental feeding when their own stores ran short, and she had watched the fall carefully enough to know that some of the newer colonies had not built up sufficient comb before the cold locked them in. She took what remained of her saved money, the last folded bills she kept in a tin on the kitchen shelf, and bought plain white sugar from the feed store in town. She mixed it with water over the wood stove in the evenings, filling mason jars she had found in the cellar, and fitted each jar with a pierced lid so the bees could feed slowly without drowning. She slipped the jars inside the hive entrances on the warmest midday hours she could find, working fast, disturbing the clusters as little as possible, then sealing everything back against the cold. It cost her more than she had planned. She ate simply that month, very simply. One bitter morning in late November, when the county road had gone iron-hard with frost, and the sky sat low and pale above the orchard, she heard a truck slow at the edge of the property. She did not need to look up from where she crouched beside the second row to know who it was. She could feel the pause of it, the deliberate idling, and when she finally straightened and turned, she saw him there in the cab of his truck, looking out across her rows of wrapped and straw-packed hives with an expression that was almost pitying. He shook his head slowly, just once, the way a man does when he has already decided the ending of a thing. Then he drove on. She watched the truck disappear around the bend in the road, the cold pressed against her face. From somewhere beneath the burlap at the end of the row, she thought she heard, faint and persistent, that steady low hum. Winter settled in fully after that, and she let it. There was little else to do but wait and watch and make herself useful in small ways, tightening a loose board on the farmhouse, patching a gap where the wind came through beneath the kitchen door, reading the journal in the evenings by the light of a single lamp. The old woman who had kept this place had written in a careful, unhurried hand, and the winter sections of the journal were full of patience. "Rest is not idleness," one entry read. "The bees know what the cold is for." She tried to hold on to that through February, when the cold had a way of making everything feel permanent. But March came the way it always does, not all at once, but in suggestions, a morning with less bite to it, the smell of softened earth, returning from somewhere beneath the frost. She walked the orchard on the first genuinely mild day, the journal tucked under her arm, and stood a long time among the trees. They were older than she had first realized. The apple trees had thick, grayed bark and branches that had crossed and tangled over years of no pruning, reaching in wrong directions, spending themselves on wood instead of fruit. The pear trees were similar. The wild plums had suckered out at the base and gone rangy and low. To most eyes they would have looked half-ruined, but she had read enough of the journal to know the difference between a dead tree and a neglected one, and these were neglected. There was still life moving in them. She could see it in the way the smallest outermost twigs had swelled almost imperceptibly at their tips, waiting. She started with the apple trees. The journal was specific. Cut the crossing branches first, open the center to light, and leave the younger growth that points outward and up. She worked slowly and deliberately, making each cut clean, pausing often to look up through the opened canopy at the pale early sky. It took her the better part of a week to move through all the rows, finishing with the wild plums, which she pruned more lightly, not wanting to disturb whatever they had held onto through the winter on their own. Then she waited again. It did not take long. Within 2 weeks, the tips she had spared broke into the softest green, and within a month the blossoms came, white on the apple and pear, and on the wild plum, a deep dusty pink that she had not expected and that stopped her cold the first morning she saw it. And the bees found them immediately. Every morning at first light, she stood at the edge of the orchard and watched them pour from the hives, in long, unhurried streams, moving purposefully toward the blossoms, filling the rows with a sound that was less like noise and more like the orchard itself breathing. The oldest hive sent its bees out first, ahead of all the others, as though it had been waiting for exactly this. Spring moved into early summer the way things grow, gradually, then all at once. The blossoms fell, and the petals collected in pale drifts along the fence line, and where they had been, small green fruits appeared, tight and hard and full of promise. She watched them swell through June, checking the hives each morning, keeping her notes in the back pages of the old journal where space remained. By then she had learned to read the hives the way she had once learned to read weather, not by any single sign, but by the whole of them together. The weight of a box, the pitch of the sound inside, the way the bees moved at the entrance in the early heat of the day. She had made mistakes through the spring, cut one split too early, and lost the effort, left another box too crowded before she caught the warning. But she had caught most of the warnings in time, and by midsummer, she had captured 7 swarms on her own, settled them carefully into cleaned and repaired boxes, and coaxed them patiently through their first unsettled weeks, until each one quieted and committed itself to the work of building. 11 new colonies had established since the previous fall. Some had come from splits she had made herself, dividing strong hives when they showed signs of wanting to swarm, giving each half a chance to raise its own queen. Others had arrived on their own, swarms that drifted in from the orchard's edge as though the blossoms had called them, and she had simply been ready with an empty box and enough stillness not to frighten them away. 18 hives were producing now. She walked the rows in the long midsummer evenings and felt the difference plainly, the collective warmth radiating from the boxes, the deep, purposeful hum that had replaced the silence of a year ago. The other hives were not dead. Most were in various stages of finding themselves, some with small colonies still building comb, some with newly mated queens not yet at their full laying strength. She did not rush them, but it was the oldest hive she tended with the most care and the most attention. When she pulled the first full frame from it in late July, the comb was nearly black with honey, dark amber when she held it to the light, dense and slow-moving, nothing like the pale sweetness she had tasted from the newer colonies. She uncapped a corner of it with her hive tool and brought a little to her tongue without thinking. The flavor stopped her completely. Wild plum first, deep and slightly tart, and underneath it, something rounder and older. The heritage apple blossoms, she thought, the ones that had not bloomed in years until this spring, both of them together. The whole orchard in a single taste. She stood there a long moment, holding the frame, not moving. She harvested slowly, over 3 full days, the way the journal had advised, for a first real pull. Not greedy, not rushed. Take what is offered, the old handwriting had said, and leave what is needed. She moved through the rows each morning, while the dew was still on the grass, working before the heat climbed, lifting frames with the same care she had learned to use from the very beginning. Deliberate, quiet, no sudden movements. The honey varied more than she had expected. The newer colonies, the ones still finding their strength, gave frames of pale gold, light and clean tasting, with a brightness that reminded her of late clover. The older, more established hives ran darker, and from the oldest hive, the comb came out nearly black in the shadow of the box, and deep amber when she tilted it into the morning light, heavy as she carried it, dense in a way that felt almost solid compared to the others. She had set up her extracting equipment inside the farmhouse kitchen, a second-hand hand-crank extractor she had traded work for in early spring, a wide uncapping knife, basins, a fine mesh strainer, and every glass jar she had been able to collect over the past several months. She had started saving them in winter, asking at the feed store, at the church, wherever someone might have empty jars they did not need. Dozens of them had come to her that way, mismatched in size, some with old paper labels still stuck to the glass, washed clean and waiting on the kitchen shelves. She uncapped frames at the table, working steadily, the wax curling away in long, pale strips. The extractor spun slowly, then faster, the honey beginning to move down the walls of the drum and pool at the bottom. When she opened the spigot and watched the first stream of it run into the strainer, she stayed very still. It was the color of late afternoon, somewhere between gold and rust, shifting as it moved. She filled each jar carefully, wiping the rims clean before she set the lids. Then she labeled them by hand on small squares of paper cut from a brown bag, writing the farm's location and the hive number in her plain, unhurried script. The oldest hive had its own label. She wrote the number and then paused, thinking of the carved flowers along the edges of the box, the colony that had held on through the decade of silence, and she left it at that. The number was enough. She knew what it meant. By the afternoon of the third day, the jars were lined up across the kitchen table in 2 long rows, catching the light through the west-facing window. Pale gold at one end, deepening steadily toward the rich dark amber of the oldest hive at the other. She stood in the doorway looking at them for a long time. The afternoon light moved slowly across the jars. She was up before dawn on market day. The jars were already wrapped in cloth and packed into the wagon bed, nested in straw so they would not shift against each other on the county road. She had counted them the night before, 43 jars in total, ranging from the lightest clover pale at the front of the load to the darkest ones from the oldest hive, tucked carefully at the back. She had brought a small handwritten sign, too, cut from the same brown paper as the labels, leaned against the side panel where people could read it as they passed. The drive to town took the better part of an hour. The road was quiet that early, the fields on either side still holding the night's cool, the sky lightening in thin bands above the tree line. She kept the horse to a steady walk. By the time she reached the market grounds, most of the stalls were already half set. She found her space and began unloading, placing each jar in rows on the wooden table the market provided, tallest jars at the back, smaller ones in front. She arranged the dark ones from the oldest hive slightly apart at one end, where the morning light would catch them. The neighboring farmer had a stall 2 rows over. He was a regular at this market, known for his corn and dried beans, and his table was wide and stacked full. When he noticed her wagon parked nearby, he looked over. He crossed his arms and watched her set out her jars without saying anything. She did not look back at him. The market opened, and people moved through the rows slowly at first, the way they always did in the early hour, browsing without hurry. Then a woman stopped at her table and picked up one of the dark amber jars from the oldest hive. She held it up against the sky, the way people do when light itself becomes part of what they are deciding. She set it back down and bought 2. That was how it started. Within the hour, there was usually someone standing at her table. People passed jars to each other, mothers to daughters, old men to their wives, strangers who happened to reach for the same jar at the same moment, and started talking. Several people asked where the farm was. She told them plainly. The old place at the end of the county road, the one with the orchard. More than one person nodded, as if they knew exactly which farm she meant. By late morning, the dark jars were gone. By a little before noon, the table was empty. She was folding the cloth back over the bare wood when she heard footsteps slow behind her. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. She could feel the pause in it, the weight of a man reconsidering something. She turned around slowly. He stood there with his hat in his hands, which surprised her more than anything he could have said. He was a big man, and he had always carried himself like one, but standing at an empty market table with his hat brim turning slowly between his fingers, he looked like what he was, a neighbor who had been wrong and knew it. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. Men like him rarely found the words for that, and she had stopped needing them, somewhere between the first hard frost and the morning she had pulled her first full frame from the oldest hive alone, without anyone watching, without anyone to tell. He looked at the empty table. He looked at the bare wood where the jars had been. Then he reached into his coat pocket and set a coin on the table. The right amount, she noticed, for one of the dark amber jars. Not a jar she had anymore, just the price of one, left there like a quiet admission. She folded the coin into her palm and said nothing. He put his hat back on and walked away through the market crowd, and that was all there was to it. The following week, she drove into town on a Tuesday morning and signed the lease at the county land office. The man behind the desk had a kind face and seemed genuinely pleased that someone wanted the old place, that it was going to be kept up rather than left to go further back into the weeds. She signed her name carefully, the way you do when something finally belongs to you, and she drove home with the papers folded in her coat pocket and her hands steady on the reins. She came past his fence line on the way back. She was not thinking about him by then. She was thinking about the pear trees along the eastern edge of the orchard, which needed pruning before the season turned, and about the 2 new colonies she hoped to coax into empty hives before summer's end. But he was there, standing at his fence post, not working, just standing, the way a man stands when he has been waiting for something to pass and wants to acknowledge it without making a ceremony of it. She kept the horse at its pace. He raised one hand, a slow and deliberate thing, and gave a single nod. She returned it, just barely, and looked back at the road ahead. Behind her, behind the county road and the long grass along its edges and the weathered gate she had learned to lift just so, the orchard was blooming. Pink and white against the late summer sky, branches heavy with what the season had kept in patience and was only now releasing. And beyond the orchard, in their long quiet rows, 100 hives stood in the golden evening light, and the air above them hummed with everything she had stayed to tend.